The Royal Cayman Trust Building was a fortress of glass and steel. I walked in wearing a silk dress, my best pearls, and a pair of sunglasses that said, "Don't even think about it." I presented the black key and my ID. The manager, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of mahogany, went pale when he saw the key. He led me to a private room deep underground, guarded by biometric scanners and men who looked like they hadn't smiled since the Cold War. "Vault 777 is a legacy account, Mrs. Peterson," the manager said, his voice trembling. "It hasn't been accessed in decades." He turned the master key, I inserted my black key, and the heavy circular door hissed open. I expected piles of gold or stacks of cash, but what I found was much more valuable and much more dangerous. Inside were rows of safety deposit boxes, and in the center, a single, antique mahogany chest. Inside weren't just diamonds, though there were enough of those to make a disco ball look dull. There were the original land deeds to half the coastline. But at the very bottom, wrapped in silk, was a leather-bound journal. It wasn't Frank's. It was my father Henry's. I started reading, and my heart nearly stopped. Henry hadn't just been a clockmaker. He'd been the architect of the entire Vance financial empire. He hadn't died in an accident. He'd faked his death to protect me from the very people Silver Fox worked for. And the black box in the basement? It was only half the story. This journal contained the master codes to the Tree, the organization that controlled the Fixers, the Watchmen, and the Vances. "Oh, Henry," I whispered, clutching the book to my chest. "You didn't just leave me a cottage. You left me the keys to the kingdom." Suddenly, the lights in the vault flickered and turned red. The heavy door behind me started to slide shut. "Going somewhere, Eleanor?" A voice echoed through the vault's intercom. It wasn't Silver Fox. It was a woman's voice, sharp, cold, and sounding suspiciously like a more mature version of Tiffany. "Did you really think the sugar baby was acting alone?" The voice laughed. "Tiffany is my daughter, Eleanor, and Frank was just the fool we used to get to your father's legacy. You found the journal, but you'll never leave this vault with it." I looked at the closing door. I had 30 seconds before I was buried alive in a tomb of diamonds and secrets. But this grandma doesn't just bake cookies. She knows how to handle a timer. I saw a small emergency manual override near the ventilation shaft, the same kind Frank had in his basement. I didn't have my tools, but I had a heavy gold bar from the chest. I smashed the glass, pulled the lever, and rolled under the closing door just as it slammed shut with a bone-shattering thud. I was back in the hallway, but I wasn't alone. Standing there were 4 men in tactical gear, and in the center was a woman I recognized from the old Vance family photos. It was Frank's first wife, the one he told me had died in a car crash 40 years ago. "Hello, Eleanor," she said, pulling out a silenced pistol. "I believe you have my husband's journal." My jaw dropped. Frank hadn't just cheated on me, he'd been a bigamist for nearly half a century, and his dead wife was the head of the organization that was hunting me. "Well, sugar," I said, tucked the journal into my purse, and reaching for the heavy fire extinguisher on the wall. "I guess it's time for a second divorce, and this one, it's gonna be permanent." I pulled the pin on the extinguisher, filled the hallway with a blinding white cloud, and ran for the elevator. As the doors closed, I could hear her screaming my name. I reached the lobby, burst out into the tropical sun, and didn't stop until I reached the docks. I didn't go back to the hotel. I hopped onto a waiting speedboat I'd prearranged, thanks to another tip from Henry's journal, and headed for the open sea. As the island faded into the distance, I opened the journal to the last page. There was a coordinates list and a final note. "Eleanor, the third house isn't a building, it's a ship. Find the timepiece in the Florida Keys. It's time to cut the tree down." Frank thought he was flying to the beach with a young woman, but he ended up in a cage. I went to the beach alone, and I'm coming back with an army. This grandma is trading her knitting needles for a harpoon. Hold on to your sun hats, sugar, 'cause Grandma Eleanor is trading her rocking chair for a speedboat and heading straight into the eye of the storm. After barely escaping that diamond-encrusted tomb in the Caymans and finding out Frank's dead first wife Beatrice was very much alive and running a crime syndicate. I had a one-way ticket to the Florida Keys. Henry's journal was tucked into my corset, because nobody suspects a grandma's cleavage is a vault for international secrets. And I was looking for the timepiece. I arrived at the marina at midnight. The air was thick and humid, smelling of salt and diesel. And there she was, the timepiece. It wasn't just a boat, it was a 100-foot mega yacht that looked like it belonged to a Bond villain. I didn't have an invitation, but I had Henry's master key. I hopped onto the deck, light as a cat, and used the key to override the security system. Click. The sliding glass doors hissed open like a snake in the grass. Inside, the yacht was a palace of mahogany and gold. I made my way to the bridge, but the silence was too loud. You know what I mean? I could hear my own heart thumping like a flat tire. Suddenly, the lights flared on, blinding me. "You always did have impeccable timing, Eleanor," a voice drawled. I blinked as my vision cleared. Standing at the bar, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, was Beatrice, the woman who had been a ghost for 40 years. Beside her stood Silver Fox, looking just as smug as ever. "I've spent half my life waiting for you to find that journal," Beatrice said, stepping into the light. She was dressed in white silk, looking more like a queen than a criminal. Henry hid the encryption keys to the tree's global assets in the timepiece's main server. "I couldn't access them without your father's biometric signature. Or yours," I said, pulling out my kitchen knife. "Hey, it's a classic for a reason. I guess you've been waiting a long time to be disappointed, because I ain't giving you a single thumbprint." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Oh, Eleanor, Frank was a fool, a weak link who wanted a young girl and a beach house. But I want the world, and since you won't cooperate, I'll just have to take what I need from your cold, dead fingers." Silver Fox moved toward me, but I wasn't just some helpless old woman. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, high-frequency jammer I'd found in Henry's vault. I slammed it onto the console. Zap! The yacht's electronics went haywire. The lights flickered, the alarm started screaming, and the yacht's engines roared to life, lurching forward into the dark ocean. In the chaos, I dove behind the captain's chair. "If I'm going down, Beatrice, I'm taking your fancy boat and your tree with me." Silver Fox lunged, but I gave him a taste of Grandma's special move. A heavy brass lamp to the temple. He went down like a sack of potatoes. Beatrice, however, was faster. She pulled out her pistol, but before she could fire, the yacht hit a massive wave, throwing us both against the walls. "The server is in the hull, isn't it?" I shouted over the alarm. I didn't wait for an answer. I scrambled down the stairs, heading deep into the belly of the beast. I found the server room, glowing with thousands of blue lights. It was the brain of the entire organization. I pulled out the journal and looked for the final code. "To stop the clock, you must break the gears," Henry had written. I didn't try to hack it. I didn't try to download it. I grabbed a heavy fire axe from the wall and started swinging. I was smashing 40 years of lies, 40 years of Frank's cheating, and 40 years of a family that had tried to bury me alive. "Stop!" Beatrice screamed, reaching the doorway. She fired, the bullet grazing my shoulder, but I didn't stop. With one final mighty swing, I buried the axe into the main cooling unit. Liquid nitrogen sprayed everywhere, and the servers began to pop and smoke. The digital tree was burning. The yacht was shaking now, taking on water. Beatrice looked at the ruin of her empire, and then at me, her eyes filled with pure, unadulterated rage. "You've destroyed everything." "No, sugar," I said, holding onto a railing as the boat tilted. "I just balanced the books." Suddenly, a hand grabbed me from behind. It was Silver Fox, his face bloodied, but determined. He dragged me toward the deck. "If we can't have the data, we'll have the woman who knows it all." We burst onto the deck. The yacht was sinking fast. A black helicopter was hovering above, lowering a rescue line. Beatrice grabbed the line, looking down at me with a smirk. "Enjoy the bottom of the ocean, Eleanor." But what they didn't see was the small GPS-linked flare I had pinned to Beatrice's silk robe during the scuffle. "See you in the headlines, Beatrice," I yelled as I jumped over the railing into the freezing dark water. I hit the surface and sank deep, the cold stinging my skin. But as I surfaced, I saw the sky light up. not from the sun, but from a dozen Coast Guard helicopters that had been tracking the flare I planted on Beatrice. As I floated in the waves, watching the timepiece disappear into the depths, I felt a strange sense of peace. Frank was in a cell, Tiffany was in handcuffs, and Beatrice was currently being rescued by the federal authorities. A rescue boat pulled up beside me. A young officer reached out his hand. "Are you okay?" I took his hand, climbed aboard, and squeezed the water out of my hair. I looked at the morning sun rising over the Florida coast. "I'm just fine, honey," I said, "but I think I'm going to need a very large piña colada, and maybe a new husband, one who actually knows how to buy 2 tickets. But as I wrapped myself in a warm blanket, I felt something in my pocket. A small, waterproof micro SD card that had ejected from the server when I hit it with the axe. I hadn't destroyed the tree. I had just put the whole world's secrets in my pocket. Stay tuned, babies. Grandma's got the receipts, and the world is about to get a very big bill. Dry your eyes and pull yourselves together, sugar. 'Cause Grandma Eleanor didn't just survive a shipwreck to come home and bake snickerdoodles. I was back on solid ground in Florida, draped in a rescue blanket. But in my pocket sat that waterproof micro SD card. The golden ticket to every dirty secret the tree had ever planted. Beatrice was in federal custody, screaming about her rights, and Frank was probably trying to trade his wedding ring for a pack of cigarettes in county lockup. I didn't head back to my cottage. Not yet. I booked a room at the fanciest hotel in Miami, using a black card I'd borrowed from the yacht safe. I sat down at a high-speed laptop, plugged in that SD card, and let out a whistle that could wake the dead. This wasn't just bank accounts and payoff lists. This was the master map of every crooked politician and corporate shark from London to Tokyo. "Well, Eleanor," I said to my reflection in the mirror, "you've spent 47 years being a good wife to a man who didn't deserve your shadow. I think it's time you became the boss." I didn't call the police. I called a very specific number I'd found in Henry's journal, the emergency line for the board of global directors. These were the men who sat above the tree, the ones who didn't care about Frank or Beatrice, only about their own privacy. A man with a voice like gravel answered on the third ring. "Who is this?" "This is the woman who has your entire digital soul in her apron pocket, sugar," I said, my voice as cold as a January morning. "And I'm about to go live on every news station in the Western Hemisphere, unless we reach an agreement." The silence on the other end lasted a full minute. "What do you want, Mrs. Peterson?" "First off, I want every charge against me dropped. Not that I've done anything wrong, but I don't want the paperwork," I began. "Second, I want the Sunset Project erased from existence. No more disposals. And third, I want a formal invitation to the next board meeting. It's time you had someone on the board who knows how to keep a house clean. You're blackmailing the most powerful men on earth, Eleanor," the voice hissed. "Honey, I've been married to Frank for nearly half a century. You don't scare me one bit," I replied. "You have 1 hour to send a private jet to Miami, and tell the pilot to bring some of those fancy little cookies. I'm famished." While I waited, I made one more call, to the prison where Frank was being held. "Hello, Frank," I said when he finally picked up. "How's the one-ticket lifestyle treating you?" "Eleanor, get me out of here. I'll do anything. I'll leave Tiffany. I'll be a better husband," he blubbered like a baby. "Oh, Frank, you still don't get it," I said, sipping my tea. "I didn't just take your money and your mistress. By the time I'm done, the name Frank Peterson will be nothing more than a footnote in a cautionary tale about why you never, ever underestimate a woman with a knitting bag." "What are you doing?" he gasped. "I'm heading to Switzerland, Frank, to the main headquarters. I'm going to personally oversee the restructuring of your former associates. And as for you, I've made sure your cellmate is a man who really, really hates people who cheat on their wives." I hung up before he could finish his scream. An hour later, I was back in the air, but this time the jet was even bigger. I wasn't running anymore, I was hunting. I spent the flight looking through the SD card, picking out the names of the people who had helped Frank plan my disposal. One by one, I sent their locations to the local authorities anonymously. If I was going to be at the top, I had to prune the garden first. When we landed in Zurich, a fleet of black limousines was waiting. I stepped out, looking like $1,000,000. because I literally was worth about 10,000 times that now. I walked into the boardroom, a place of cold marble and even colder men. They all stood up when I entered. The man with the gravelly voice was at the head of the table. "Mrs. Peterson, I believe you have the card?" I held it up between my thumb and forefinger. "I have the original, but don't think for a second I haven't hidden 10 copies in places you'll never find. One wrong move, and the tree gets chopped down for firewood." "So what is the first order of business?" he asked, looking defeated. I sat down in the biggest chair at the table and kicked off my shoes. "First," I said, "we're going to talk about a little thing called retirement packages, because I'm about to retire all of you." But as I looked at the monitors on the wall, one screen caught my eye. It was a live feed from my own cottage back home. There was someone standing on my porch. Someone who looked exactly like Henry, my father, 40 years ago. My heart stopped. "Henry?" I whispered. The man on the screen looked directly into the hidden camera and held up a pocket watch, the exact same one I'd used to stop the timepiece yacht. "The game isn't over, Eleanor," a voice whispered through the room's speakers. "It's just moving to the next level." I realized then that Henry hadn't just faked his death once. He had been playing the long game for 40 years.